Hello everybody, I'm Helen Margetts. I'm going to chair this session. I'm director of the Oxford Internet Institute and I'm a political scientist, so I'm in a different tribe from Philip. And I guess a lot of us are from different tribes. That's the nature of data science and people who think about how to use new data sources. So Philip Treleaven is a professor of computing. He's the director of Financial Computing Center at UCL. And he's a specialist in computational finance, and he's been that since before big data was a thing. I guess also like quite a lot of people here. He's also an expert in algorithmic trading. And has generally pioneered the use of computational techniques in finance, such as the auto-detection of fraud and other strategies. So he's one of the, I guess there aren't so many computer scientists who've thought, like Philip has, about the applications of these techniques to government, again, before, quite a lot of us started thinking about it. So let's see what he has to say. He's going to speak for 30, 40 minutes, and then there'll be good time for questions from you and from the algorithm. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll try and say a few controversial things to encourage questions. The first thing is I'd like to start with a bit of a vision. I think that we are experiencing a revolution like we've never seen before. And what you've got is you've got a perfect storm of technologies like AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, etc., that have come together. And I think in terms of policy, we probably are waking up to the fact that things are changing very fast and having a huge impact. We've talked in the past about IT revolutions, but most of these IT revolutions have been incremental. You've gone big deal. You've moved from a desktop to a laptop to a smartphone. Now, if it is like we increasingly believe that this is more like the Industrial Revolution, in I think around about 1835, 80% of the population lived and worked in the countryside. And 30 years later, 30, 40 years later, 50% of the population lived in towns and cities. And this is the sort of magnitude that we think is likely to happen. And why government's so important is government is in an ideal position to actually provide policy, provide vision, drive this, but it also has to clear up the problems, and like large numbers of people needing to be retrained and finding new types of jobs. And for example, this will be probably the first revolution where large numbers of the professions, white-collar workers, maybe need to find new careers or need to be retrained. So firstly, you've got things like the Uberization of finance, insurance, legal services, etc. In these areas, many of the companies say that they don't know what their industry is going to look like in the next 3 or 4 years, not the next 20 years. Professional jobs are being replaced by robo-advisors. And there's a lot of discussion in the press now about the legal status of algorithms and whether artificial intelligence needs to be managed, by the law. And this is obviously going to lead to massive disruption, and possibly even the movement of people to the Middle East and the Far East. And as I said, we think about blockchain, Internet of Things, and AI as having a big impact in finance, but the biggest impact is going to be in government. And what I would like to talk about is, can we develop a grand vision the title of the subtitle for this conference is Government by Algorithm, where we can sort of use the public sector to actually drive this change rather than just being reactive. Because I think one of the problems that we've got in many Western countries is the electorate are getting increasingly nervous. They're looking for a vision for the future, and the politicians are not providing it. Okay? So this is the sort of sub-theme. Now, interestingly, there is a case study, which I'll come back to, where a government has taken a radical solution, and this is Estonia. Interestingly, and I'll say this again, in 1991, when they parted from the old Soviet Union, only 50% of the population had a telephone. So rather than just, incrementally doing things, they were in a greenfield situation where they could actually implement something fundamentally different. And what they did was they systematically implemented digital government. And it's had an interesting effect. Obviously, there are things like you can do your tax return now in 2 minutes, which I expect many of us would envy. You can vote online. All of these digital services that you might expect from government naturally flow from the infrastructure that they've put in place. Interestingly also, Estonia is now generating more startups and entrepreneurs for head of population than any other country in the world. So it's a good role model. But the point that I'll be making throughout this is that actually there's a bit more to do. And these are all the AI technologies that you need to build on top of this, where you can do things like, chatbots to interact with the general public, citizens, robo-advisors to support civil servants and all of these sorts of things. So just a little bit of history that Helen previously mentioned. Probably about 25 to 30 years ago, we built a lot of the early financial fraud detection systems, starting by building the insider dealing detection system for the London Stock Exchange. For the last 12 years, we've been automating finance. So we've been building algorithmic trading systems to try and automate trading. And this has obviously been a revolution. Interestingly, there's been a bit of a sort of back off from doing completely automated trading to where there's increasingly bringing in human experts to do what humans are good for. Currently, we're working with the regulators to try and automate regulation because it's absolutely a mess at the moment. And what we'd like to do is to do more in trying to automate government. Now, one of the great things that I'm Professor of Computing, and if we've got other people from academia here, we've got 1,000 students that are very good with skills in AI, programming, blockchain, and all of these sorts of things. And we put them out into organizations, both public and private sector, to actually do experiments. And it's a great way to do fairly risky experiments without it being risky, because we don't have to pay them. And as somebody said in the Cabinet Office, no one ever got fired, by having a student do something or not delivering. So we've got, around 1,000 students, including 80 PhD students. Now, does anyone know this film? I can never remember it. What's it called? Yeah, that's why I always put that in, so I can remember it. The great thing about this is the sort of future where you can actually predict what people want to do, behavioral finance, predictive analytics. And it's not something just that's sci-fi. It's something that is already being used in things like law enforcement, etc. But also, it's inherently dangerous because you're making decisions, particularly if you're sending people to prison, based on AI technology, which may not be able to explain why it's made the decision. So interesting concept. And just to run through the obvious technologies, there are two key technologies here. The first is a technology that's been around for a long time called knowledge-based systems, where you code up knowledge as a set of rules. And this is the technology that's actually used to drive call centers when you ring in and you ask for a mortgage or a loan. And then there's possibly the more dangerous one, which is machine learning, where you actually train the system, and interestingly, the program evolves without programming, and therefore you may not know what it's going to do. The other thing that's probably more important for government in the short term is blockchain technology. And there are two parts of this. The first is distributed ledger technology, which is like a secure audit trail or database of records that are chained together, and it's very difficult to actually corrupt it. So it's a very good thing for including things like the land registry, possibly passports, driving licenses, etc. And the other one, which is going to have a huge impact, is smart contracts. Now, ultimately, what people are trying to do is to code up legal contracts as computer programs. At the moment, it's really sort of smart transactions. And these are the sorts of technologies, particularly smart contracts, that are going to replace a lot of back office functions or automate them. But to talk about the likely impact, if you could code up legislation in terms of a smart contract, you can then do things like you can run it before it's implemented. You could test out possible impacts. You can do scenario modeling on it, etc. So we think at some stage it will have quite a big impact on statutes and the law. In the short term, we're looking at things like regulations, and in the very short term, the banks, for example, are looking at using smart contract technologies for actually settlements and things like this. The other enormous thing, which is absolutely going to be huge for government, is Internet of Things. And the government's invested in a really interesting technology called BIM, Building Information Modeling, where in the future, when you build some infrastructure, whether it's a building or some road system, you'll start off by building a digital model of that system, which will allow you to both guide again, to do simulations to see how things are going to develop. You can use it for computer-aided design when you're actually building the facility. You can use it to manage the facility during the life of the facility. You can use it to decommission the facility. And then underlying this, you've got the smart contract technology. So, for example, let's say that light bulb breaks in the future. It won't be somebody walking around saying, the light's broken. It'll be a program that looks after that light saying, I'm broken. I'll Uberize a fitter to come and change the light. Once I've verified that he's done it and the light actually works, I will pay them. Okay? These are the sorts of things that aren't that many years away, and these two technologies going together. Now, with something like BIM and smart contracts, the government will have the ability to actually manage the national infrastructure on a grand scale. I'd like to talk about a particular success story, because one of the problems, and I say this is a problem with the public sector, is it's quite risk averse. And if we're going to actually get the benefit from these technologies, you're going to have to take risks. And an example of something that's worked very well is the Financial Conduct Authority, who are, I believe, a role model for public sector innovation and automation. And what they're trying to do is to automate the financial compliance and regulation. And they're actually at the forefront of this in the world, even farther ahead than Singapore and Hong Kong. And they've introduced a thing called Project Innovate, where they work with what you might call risky companies to allow them to do experimentation, implement new systems in a sort of controlled environment. They run these sandboxes where you can do experiments. They run hackathons where they get both large and small companies and also students in to actually prototype ideas. And they're increasingly working with startups and academics to push this forward. And I don't expect you to take this in, but if I'll raise my voice, what we're doing mainly at the moment is automated advice. And one of the things we're doing, which started out almost as a joke and has now become quite an interesting project, is two of my MSc students said they wanted to build a chatbot. And I said, what for? And they said, oh, to fill in HR forms. I said, oh, it doesn't sound very exciting to me. I said, actually, I've got a copy of the FCA handbook, 20,000 pages. It's absolutely penetrable. And I've got it in XML. Why don't you connect the chatbot to the FCA handbook? And they said, oh, wonderful. And I said, oh, by the way, we've got a collaboration with Amazon. So rather than build your own chatbot, why don't you connect Amazon Alexa to the FCA handbook? That's where the joke comes in, you know. Then they were super excited. Unfortunately, FCA became super excited. I smelt a big problem. It's probably not going to work. So I then went around saying to everybody, look, you know, it's a nice idea, but it won't work, so don't get too excited. Actually, it's worked very well. And at a test, it actually performed better than some of the FCA experts. I hope there's nobody here from the FCA to report back to that. Anyway, but there's an example where the FCA are in the public sector, they're experimenting, it doesn't cost them anything, and they've done something quite revolutionary. Better? Oh, okay. Thank you. I've just been told off by my co-presenter. So what might you do? Well, firstly, you've got all this wonderful technology that works, like chatbots and things like this, and you can use this to interact with the general public. There's robo-advisors that you can use to support civil servants. You've got blockchain technology that you can use to encode the national public records. You've got, as I said, you've got BIM, and you've got smart contracts that you can use to manage the national infrastructure. And then so on, you can actually use the same technology to actually build simulation models of policy and such like. I'll skip over that. Now, let's start with public services. One of the things when I go into organizations who are interested in innovation in the sort of data science area is, well, what do you suggest we do? And I say, well, imagine if Google came in to run your company or organization, what would they do? So if Google or Amazon, God forbid, as I should say, was asked to run the public sector, the sort of thing that they would introduce is a digital identity for everybody. And we had a very interesting talk this morning on lots of countries are doing this. Digital signatures, a personal citizen record where you've got all the information about a particular citizen. So if they touch the government, the person they touch can actually serve multiple interests. And finally, a single government portal where they can access all these information online. And this is essentially what Estonia has done using blockchain technology with their e-Estonia. And what they have is they have a digital identity, a digital registry, a digital service portal, and they're now, very interestingly, offering digital residency to people that want to actually do business in Estonia or the European Union. So the point is, which is the whole crux of what I'm saying is, when you're going to do digital government and e-government, you need to have a grand vision. There's still a lot more you can do, and then build on top of this. And because they've got this basic blockchain infrastructure in, it's very easy for them to build what you might call apps for different services on top of this infrastructure. Interestingly, besides being a sort of role model for the public sector, they're happy to give you their technology. So if anybody, wants, get in touch with them. The next one is things like chatbots to support civil servants, robo-advisors. I've talked about IoT, AI for regulation, and increasingly automation of the courts. Now, with all of these things, if you implemented them on top of a sort of an Estonia-type platform, you've got all the hooks in place to actually make it run seamlessly. I should say that there's been some wonderful, humorous stories about chatbots getting it wrong. One of the most well-known one is Microsoft's Tay, which some of you may have, and they trained it off Twitter messages, and some clever people got in there and managed to make it a Trump-supporting, racist, misogynist, so it had to go to bed early. Equally, there's now some Chinese chatbots. When asked, what did you think of the Communist Party, it can't last was the answer. That chatbot didn't last very long either. So it's gone away. Okay. Support of civil servants. This is a Chinese robot that does case management for the courts in China, and it goes around, I suppose, talking to people, and it's already handled 15,000 cases. Then me being rude say, all guilty, but anyway. So obviously we can go one further. We can actually, in the Financial Conduct Authority, employ an enforcement robot using our dialect technology. Okay? I was only joking. Anyway. One of the areas where there's great opportunity, as shown by the Estonians, is actually using distributed ledger technology for public records. And all the technology's proved. There are lots of examples and prototype systems around, not just in the UK, but in lots of countries, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, and in states in the United States. And therefore, it isn't a sort of punt into the future. It's a technology that's already proved and we could just put in place. But to make the best use of it, you want to do it in a comprehensive way so that all the information is implemented in the same system, rather than having lots of little experiments which actually don't communicate together. I've already talked about the national physical infrastructure. The potential here is enormous. Within the next 10 years, new buildings, roads, things like this that have been put up will all be digitized. We'll all have IP addresses, and we can run them in real time. We can simulate them before you put things in place to actually see what they're going to, what's likely to happen. And I think this technology, for example, for BIM, the government, I believe, has already invested about 200 million in it. So these are significant, major projects. The other one that's particularly interesting is the use of particularly smart contracts. for statutes, laws, and in my particular interest, compliance. And what we're moving towards very quickly is that the government has announced that it's going to introduce online dispute resolution to handle an increasing number of cases in the courts. So therefore, what they'll do is, for things like divorce and financial disputes up to, say, maybe £100,000, you will go through an automated system. And this is likely to happen quite quickly, both in the UK. And what they will then do is keep raising the bar so that more and more court cases will actually become automated. The missing part is automating the lawyers for doing things like case management and risk analysis and things like this. And what you want to do is to actually join the two things together. No, I don't think there are any plans for this at the moment, but this is where the government's in an ideal position to actually provide leadership for particular sectors. Because if the government doesn't do it, it probably either won't happen or it will take a long time to happen. And already there's a number of exemplars out there, like the EU Consumer ODR platform, the UK's Money Claims Online, and there are even commercial companies providing this sort of technology. Now, an exciting area is actually building simulation models for public policy development. There are technologies in artificial intelligence like agent-based modeling where you can actually build models of policies, laws, etc., and you can actually run simulations on them. And this is going to take policy, and obviously will affect lots of us, from qualitative to quantitative. And also, will allow you to actually make use of all the data that's available around online. One area that's of particular interest to me is actually the legal status of algorithms. And this is a potentially huge area. And the reason this is important is quite a few of the consumer algorithms that are in place, that are making decisions about which candidates to interview for a job, whether to increase some prisoner's sentence, etc., are making decisions and are likely to be either ethically challenged or possibly even illegal. And a lot of these are black boxes, so they can't even explain the decisions that they're making, and therefore this is clearly unacceptable and needs changing. The other thing is we're getting into a situation where we need to decide how algorithms need to be regulated. So I'll give you an example. Huge amount of interest in autonomous vehicles. You're the programmer or the company that's developing the technology for these vehicles, and you can spot a crash that's about to happen. You can see an accident. And the choice is, do you sacrifice the car? Do you sacrifice the occupants? Do you sacrifice the dog that's run across the street? Do you sacrifice the people in the other car? Etc. Now, these are huge ethical decisions, and software people are going to be making these decisions with algorithms going forward. But equally, we need to know what these sort of algorithms are going to do in these sort of situations. So I'll finish now by saying, for the public sector, there's a huge opportunity here. I would encourage you to experiment, building systems, with blockchain and AI for particular applications. But what the public sector needs to do is to get, I believe, a grand vision that brings together both what the Estonians have done with their blockchain technology. So you have an integrated low level, but also integrate on top of this all the sorts of things that you can get from AI, Internet of Things, etc. And if you're in a country, whether it's the UK or elsewhere, and put in place this sort of base infrastructure, it'll be a lot easier to actually implement things on top of it because you'll have hooks, etc. Okay? So the final one is think ambitious. Okay.
Try now. One problem that I've been bothered about for a couple of years now is the Internet of Things, coupled with personal data, coupled with the need to regulate interconnection between things out in the Internet. We have GDPR coming into action in about 8 months' time. And we really need to be in an automated position to solve those problems. Now, I wondered if that makes a possible case study. I'm thinking of the regulation of the devices and their connectivity.
Helen, why don't you answer that?
Well, I mean, I suppose that links a bit into a question that I have, is that, I mean, you mentioned Estonia a few times, and you mentioned the grand vision of Estonia. But I mean, Estonia have been thinking in that way for a pretty long time now. Most of the things you're talking about actually predate even blockchain technologies, although there are some similarities. I mean, when do you really think the British government is going to look like Estonia? Because you might, I mean, it does. There is a sense of jam tomorrow about that for those of us who spend a lot of our research looking at digital government. I mean, you know,
I think you could say, when is any Western government going to get its act together? Yes, is that fair?
Yes, I think so, but that might be dissolving the difficult and impossible. I mean,
Yes,
you know.
I think that, as I said before, I think we're in this sort of social revolution, and it's very important that we try and do things as quickly as possible and on a grand scale. Otherwise, we will be playing catch up. And the longer we leave things, the more difficult it would be to, to create new industries, to help people move jobs, etc. In answer to your question, I don't see any Western government really appreciating what's going on. I think if you went to Singapore or Hong Kong, and they understand what's happening. Even places like Dubai are starting to pile into this technology. But there's an element of complacency at national levels in Western countries that actually mirrors what you see in large companies often. We've been doing this for the last 100 years and it's been great. Why should we change? And I absolutely could be wrong about this, but I think that we need to do things and we need to do it quickly for the benefit of the population.
Do you think there's some things which are like? Can you point to anything, any particular barrier which might be overcome? I was very struck when you talked about Google, and obviously you said that they introduced an identifier, a number, an identifier, sort of straight away, and of course that is what happens when you sign up with Google or Amazon. If you
I think it's a case of often people that are running the show may not have a grand understanding. One of the great things of being in computer science is you're immersed in the technology, okay? And the students are a good example. You interact with students, you interact with companies, particularly startup companies, and you can see things changing a lot faster than you thought. And I guess this is a sort of privileged position that lots of our leaders are not in. They don't interact with this, and I think that this is maybe they don't appreciate. I'm happy to admit I could be totally wrong about this, but the changes that I think that are going on have yet to be appreciated by any of the countries. You could say probably the nearest one is Macron, who's at least got a vision that he wants to completely change France, and we'll see what happens with the unions in the next few months.
Got lots of questions now. Yes, Dave, you want to share, and then should we take two?
Thank you. I was wondering, what is your view of the role of the private sector in this evolution? Do you see this role as competing, or do you also see some areas for frenemies type of relations? I mean, the example, very simple example that comes to my mind is Google Maps, where Google is reusing public information to provide a service which is privately provided but with a public purpose to a certain extent.
Obviously the private sector can move mountains. If you look at DeepMind, that was spun out of UCL, it's probably the leading AI university in the world. It's a university without students, and they've got access to all this funding from Google. The role of government is to set the macro picture. There are lots of things that won't happen if the government doesn't actually provide the infrastructure. And that's why you can't just leave everything to the private sector. You've got to create an environment where the private sector can actually do things, but you need some sort of playing field, or whatever you want to call it. And that, I think, is what's possibly missing in lots of countries at the moment.
Hi, my name is Guy Cohen. I'm from Privitar. My question's around, if we look at the recent ransomware attacks with the NHS, we saw that was partially from unpatched old hardware. And a lot of these things, whether it's IoT devices, connected autonomous vehicles, robo-advisors, a lot of them will need ongoing support in order to be secure and prevent potentially disastrous attacks. If you think of cars that were being sold in Europe 20 years ago, now being in another country where they may not have the same things, so on and so forth. So do you see a different liability model being required for private industry to be able to sell products to consumers but also to government to ensure that we don't have huge security risks emerge as those products become outdated?
Yes, I think what organisations like the NHS need to do is to take some risks and enable more people in the private sector to actually build things for them. And I think at the moment you've got this dreadful legacy system, the sort of technology part of the NHS, and it's such a monster for them to actually change that the only way they're going to do it is with private sector help. So I think it's trying to find a balance between what the public sector does and what the private sector does for them. Does that avoid your question, or what?
We've got, should we take two questions together at the back there? One at the back and one just by you, and then we've got
So just one of the two themes that keep coming up across the talks that I've been to are trust and privacy. But on the topic of trust, in terms of kind of machine learning algorithms making decisions for things like, well, all sorts of themes that you've mentioned. I was just wondering, in terms of the computer science community, a lot of the push is towards predictive accuracy for these kind of classifying algorithms, and we always push at the cost of any type of interpretability or simpleness of the model. And if you look at Kaggle competitions, you're about getting higher and higher predictive accuracy. So in terms of working together with policymakers, how can we change the focus of computer science or machine learning so that we can actually focus on models that are applicable for these kind of uses in terms of interpretability and simpleness, so that we can actually understand how it's come to a decision? How not just what are the academic requirements for that, but how can we change that focus?
I think you've answered the question yourself, working together. Because left to your own devices, we're going to build algorithms. Some program will make a decision, about the autonomous vehicle. Okay, my responsibility is the car manufacturer, so I'll save the car. Sacrifice the people and the dog. But what there needs to be is a debate between the technologists to make them aware of things like, ethics, etc., and the policymakers bringing out these issues and saying, how can you address the fact that you need machine learning algorithms to actually explain the decisions that they're making? And this is all part of the sort of need to actually share information, across the different groups.
So I'm from the Ministry of Justice, so I think it's my job to defend government. So more a comment than a question. So I disagree with you that government isn't taking this seriously. So I would say about 20% of my meetings nowadays are all about this. Friday afternoon, I'm at a meeting all afternoon, which are about the first two boxes. So I think we are taking it seriously. I think there's a scale issue. And when you talk about the success stories, you mentioned Estonia, Hong Kong, Dubai, and Singapore. There's a size issue there which may make it easier, and at least three of them there's an element of authoritarianism which also makes it easier. So comparing those, I'm not sure are the best examples.
So there's an interesting thing that in many of these countries the public sector drives change. I don't think just because we're bigger than them, we should use that as an excuse not to do things, which I think is what
No. My point is not because we're bigger we don't do. I think it's because we're bigger it can take more time. I think that's a different statement. We are working on this. I think.
I suppose the counter argument is if you've got a big company, they can often do a lot more quicker. Because they've got the resources, etc. So I think it's actually convincing yourself we need to do it or not, and then do it as quickly as possible, because what I see at the moment is a lot of talent and ideas actually flowing to Asia, for example, and we need to make sure that we're doing things because it's important for the future.
But I guess your question might mean that it's not size of the issue, it is perhaps this question of
Inertia.
Or of the public sector, the kind of place of the public sector in the country as a whole, which is perhaps, and we can't expect the public sector to be able to rectify that. Maybe, it's
Why not?
Well, I mean, because, for example, the kind of reputation of a public sector within a polity is something that develops over many years, and we maybe need to sort of actually tackle that, actually confront that, particularly in the UK setting where we had many decades of public management reform, which were basically about denigrating the public sector and saying that the private sector, was somehow kind of better. And we maybe need to think about that and tackle that.
Well, if you look at Singapore, for example, as a sort of role model, they have a highly motivated public sector. You know it better, I'm sure, more than me, and they seem to drive things, and I think we can learn from them.
Yeah, but we have to remember that the context is different.
then the government monitise the file, monitise all the actually and that things like that, where you have much stronger sensitive values, they make these sort of practices easier. And so you have a combination of real also aligned with actually scale matters. I can't believe that you believe that scale doesn't matter.
Tom Smith from the Data Science Campus at Office for National Statistics. A different question. Should we hold algorithms to a higher ethical standard than we do humans? And the context here is our decision making is hugely opaque. I don't understand how people make decisions shortly before car crashes, in particular drivers, so picking up on your point about driverless vehicles. Also, well-known biases, for example, judges less likely to give parole just before lunch.
As a friend of an algorithm, yes. But to seriously answer your question, I think we've, at the moment, algorithms are not held to account at all. Interesting point, you know, how high can you raise the bar for them? I think we need to at least get them to obey the law, which lots of them don't at the moment. Also, there's certain... We need, you know, there are companies like Uber where they can, the algorithms basically run everything and make decisions with no right of appeal, as it were. And I'm sure that we all agree this can't go on. So whether you can actually make algorithms more accountable is an interesting session. But I think at the moment we need to make them a little bit accountable.
We've got there's 2 questions over there, 3 questions over there. Where's the mic? In the middle there, in the middle. Well, yeah, thanks.
Tanya Filer, Cambridge Institute of Public Policy. My question relates to the kind of authoritarian argument. Who do you think should regulate the use of GovTech and how, particularly in light of, you mentioned, lacks of understanding in government surrounding the use of technology?
Regulate GovTech.
Yeah, the use of GovTech.
I would point you to the FCA model, where it has worked tremendously and is seen as a sort of the flagship, you know, by other regulators in the world. So you could do the same thing they did for GovTech, which is to set up Project Innovate. And the FCA will tell you that the companies in their sandbox or Project Innovate are actually regulated to a higher level than those outside, because they see them every day and they really work with them to understand what they're doing. But it also allows the companies to innovate in a sort of safe sandbox environment. So I think, you know, the FCA have done a great service to the public sector, and I think people can copy that in other areas. So I would say do a GovTech equivalent of Project Innovate.
Okay, so a question in the middle at the back.
Hi, Carsten Jung, Bank of England. I have a question on the relationships between taking risks and rolling these things out and systemic risk and safety. So, for example, with your example of the Internet of Things and BIM smart contracts, you increase the cost of catastrophic failure, and it literally becomes an issue of life and death if say, buildings are involved. So my question is, to what extent do we also need development and push on with control systems that deal with these catastrophic risks?
I think it's very important to experiment with new ideas, and some of them are going to fail, okay, and we have to accept that. Going back to what I was saying before about the sort of Project Innovate, or I know best obviously the financial services industry, so there's lots of blockchain experiments going on. And there are bound to be potential problems, you know, with things like Bitcoin and such like. But we're trying out things. And because the FCA are working with the companies, they understand what's going on. And therefore, if they need to step in and regulate something, they can do it because they appreciate it. And I think it's important not to do a sort of stand back and let it happen. You need to do experiments. You need to work, with private sector startups and things like this in a controlled environment, so that we can have innovation, but safe innovation.
Got a question here.
Sorry for that. Thank you for the talk. I thought you brought up a lot of really interesting points in terms of cost. And what I find really interesting is that you've talked about the human cost of developing these things. But I wonder, in terms of the energy cost, because the moment we start talking about automating, we assume that we'll have energy. And at the moment, I think a large percent of the energy we're using and the electricity we have is from non-renewable sources. So I just wonder, is this something which should be developed in parallel to automation, or is this a bridge we'll cross when we get there? And also, to follow up on that, how robust would an ideal scenario be? So an Estonia type scenario, how robust would it be to failures?
There's really two questions there. I think the point you make about energy is very interesting. And because it probably should join the other items like blockchain and various other things, because without energy, it's not going to happen. And I have to say I hadn't thought about it at all. Do you want to say anything about energy? I'll pass over to the chairman when I get a difficult question.
Notice that. It's okay, you carry on. We're nearly...
Okay, so I haven't escaped. Zynet, answer the question. Yes, I think we need to take that into account, because there's clearly, a major move now to, for example, electric cars and such like. And if we can't, I don't know what energy modelling or policy modelling is going on, but it would be a very interesting thing, to look at. Really, I can't answer your question very well because I've really not thought about it. Going back to the second part, how robust is it? I think that one of the things is that the blockchain technology is quite robust, and therefore it does take things to a next level. So therefore, it's reasonably safe to adopt it.
I'm really sorry. We're going to have to start because we're almost at 1 o'clock. I would like to say, though, that I've been looking at the relationship between government and technology for a very long time, since the days when it was a really sad and lonely thing to do, and nobody would talk to you at parties. And when I first started looking at this topic, and there was a session on government technology, you certainly wouldn't have seen a packed room like this. Quite a lot of you would have chosen to kind of skip the session. Now we are having a kind of heated discussion. We're hearing the phrase GovTech, which I thought would never come. And lots of people care about it. So I think that's putting us in a better position for the future, I think, than we've been in the past. So I'd like to thank Philip, thank all of you for making that happen, and see you after lunch.